Local programming on KRWG Public Media made possible in part by viewers like you. Thank you.
Hello and welcome to Borderland Storytellers. I'm Nick Miller. On this program, we'll hear firsthand from the sons and daughters of the families who lived and worked and grew up at Stahmann Farms. The farm grew many crops, including cotton and especially pecans. There's also a long history of the people who worked there and brought their entire families and lived on the property for generations. Our featured speaker for this program is Blanca Araujo, a professor at NMSU's College of Health, Education, and Social Transformation. She was raised at Stahmann Farms and with colleagues has worked on an oral history project preserving the voices of those from this historic agricultural community. Later in the program, we'll feature a panel discussion of what life was like at Stahmann Farms. Borderland Storytellers is produced by KRWG Public Media in partnership with the NMSU Provost Office, the Center for Latin American and Border Studies, the Beyond Borders Community of Practice, the New Mexico State Department of Journalism and Media Studies, and the Creative Media Institute. We now share some history and personal stories from Stahmann Farms.
The Mesilla Valley has a long storied history of agriculture, and one of those staples is pecans. The stories being told here are about the families whose history are deeply rooted in the Borderland region and helped to make Stahmann Farms one of the top producers of pecans in the state, the country, and at one time, the world. Stahmann Farms dates back to the early 1900s, and we're with the fourth generation of Stahmann farmers.
My great-grandfather came down the Mississippi with my great-grandmother and my grandfather and his sister, and they ended up all the way down in the state of Mississippi, and they then proceeded to come out west. And they ended up settling in Tornillo. They bought a farm there and they grew cotton, they grew cantaloupe, they grew tomatoes. And so they decided to come up further north to New Mexico because the quality of the water was much better up here. It wasn't as salty as the water down in Texas and Tornillo and Fabens. So they bought land to plant their cotton. And one day a farmer could not take delivery of his pecan trees that he had bought, and so my grandfather paid for them and he decided to plant them. It ended up being that they really thrived here in the valley, and so they decided to give it a shot. He planted about, I would say, around 200,000 trees on about 4,000 acres in 7 years, from 1932 to 1939. My great-grandfather and grandfather purchased this land in 1925. My great-grandfather died 1929, so my grandfather, Dean Stahmann, took over everything and started working with his cotton, and then in 1932 he started planting the pecan trees. So the Bracero program was very useful to my family because it allowed us to bring workers up here to actually develop the farm. And my grandfather was also very involved in helping them get their residency here, to establish residency and get their permanent residence, because we'd guarantee them a job. All this area was the Santo Tomás de Iturbide. It was a Spanish land grant. This was really remote in the 1930s. So when my grandfather started planning out this farm, he divided it up into about 8 different ranches. So each family would have their own house, and then sometimes the wives would go work too, go and work in the sorting plant or in the field with picking cotton. The way it worked is that they ended up settling here and having children here, and the children would grow up and a lot of them would stay here and work. At one point, I think I had 4th generation employee here that had grown up. His great-grandfather and grandfather and father worked here.
There's now a group that meets every 3 to 6 months of people who were born and grew up on Stahmann Farms and continue to tell of the traditions and the stories of where they grew up and what they remember most fondly about growing up on Stahmann Farms.
Every time I talk to people about it, I tell them Stahmann's is a big farm. And Stahmann had about at least 8, maybe 10 little ranches inside the big farm. And each ranch used to have about 50 families. Each family used to have about at least 5 kids. So it was like a commune. It was big. You know, everybody was happy. The houses were all in a row. Everybody used to be neighbors next door. Start with Rincón, Ojito, Plaza, Esperanza, Lomas, La Fe, Cristo, Cristo Viejo, Palmilla, Snow Ranch, which Snow Ranch is considered Norte.
So when we would gather at school, we would say, "Where do you live?" "Oh, I live in El Cristo." "And where do you live?" "Esperanza." And that's how we knew. We were all Stahmann kids, but we all lived in different parts of the ranch. It was a lot of acreage.
I was actually one of the few people, I think, that remain, that was actually born there. Dr. Jenkins would come and make home deliveries. So I was born in the ranch named Palmilla.
Some of the other traditions that I really enjoyed, and it was really just farm living. We could go out and explore. We had nature out there. We had the acequias there, where everything from crawdads to frogs to whatever. So even as little children, we were studying science firsthand, and we were capturing tadpoles, and it was just very, very nice living. We were Mexicans from all parts of Mexico, and yet we were Stahmann Farm kids. We felt like a community. It didn't matter that you came from Chihuahua, you came from Torreón, you came from Tamaulipas, wherever you came from Mexico, we all became one Hispanic family at the farm. And that's what I remember best of it. We were all poor kids, but because we were on the same boat, none of us knew we were poor. We just grew up with each other. And that's why we like to get together now, because of those memories, because we were family. You know, we formed a family there.
I did grow up here, and I grew up on Snow Ranch, and so some of the fondest memories that I have are getting together with all the kids at that ranch, at that community, because we had tons of kids there. So I always had a lot of friends. I always had people to play with and kids to play with, and they were not very far from my house. They were just walking distance.
80% of the kids went to Gadsden School District, and 20 of us went to Las Cruces, because the dividing line for the district was there. Nowadays it's all Las Cruces, but before it was Gadsden. So we had that. So let's say that I wanted to have a girlfriend. I probably had a girlfriend in Gadsden, and I probably had one in Las Cruces too. So for me it was an advantage somehow, but it was nice.
Just a wonderful group of people. We were blessed. I feel very blessed to have been born and raised there.
We had a beautiful childhood, very sheltered, very natural. There was nothing compared to what children are going through nowadays. And everything was natural. I mean, we learned to swim in the river. We didn't have a swimming pool. And everybody was united. Everybody was very much a big family. In other words, if you were visiting one of your friends in the next house and it was dinner time, it was dinner time for you too. Another chair was added and another tortilla, whatever it was a meal, beans or whatever was shared with everybody. So that's the kind of memories that I recall.
There was a lot of back roads, so I remember learning to drive a car. I never had to go on the paved roads. We would learn in the back roads, and always a lot of fun going on. And it offered, the whole farm was like our backyard. So I remember growing up, going out, and the rule was, if you could eat it, you could get it. You can't take it to sell or whatever, but if you can eat it, you can eat it for free. So we would go out there and go all day, and sometimes we'd be cracking pecans just to keep going and playing and so forth.
There always used to be a baseball team, and there's a place going up towards the airport where they made a baseball field. And the road would go up, but in between there was a big open area, and they used to call it La Taza or La Copa. And that's where we used to play ball all the time. And we used to play football, and the trees were out of bounds, and believe me, they don't move. We used to play against each other, right? Other different teams, different ranches, like one ranch would play the other. And it was awesome because, you know, we have that going on for all throughout football season. Basketball came around, we used to play against the other ranches on basketball also. So yeah, we kept ourselves pretty much going involved in that too.
Music was a form of entertainment, and it was something to keep us busy and out of trouble. And we did we did music for most of the parties at Stahmann Farms. We played at the Riverside Hall. We came to El Paso too. And we had a band called the Innovations. At that time, Stahmann Farms and Sunland Park were having some issues. And then to top it off, we had a wedding to go to play at Sunland Park, and we were scared because they're gonna beat us up, you know. But our drummer, who was my brother then, didn't show up, and another guitar player. But when we got to Sunland Park, we knew that we were gonna get beaten. We said, well, how can we resolve this? And said, let's get a drummer from the audience. And he was a drummer from Sunland Park, and we made it okay. So Carlos Castillos, I remember him.
My parents brought me there to Stahmann's when I was a year old. I was there till 18 years that I had to leave to go to school actually in Albuquerque. But my father worked for Mr. Stahmann for 36 years. It's awesome because my dad started as picking pecans, irrigating. My dad had no education. He never went to school. And at the end, when my dad retired from Stahmann's, my dad was in charge. He was a main man for refrigeration. He was in charge of the electricians, in charge of the welders, in charge of the metal workers. He was a big foreman there for Mr. Stahmann.
At the time, there was drought and there was no work. And so the Bracero program was occurring here in the United States. And my dad heard about it. And so he came over to Ciudad Juarez, and then he was processed in Socorro. The farmers would come from everywhere and say, who knows how to drive a tractor? Who knows how to do this? And they would gather and say, oh, I do. And so, but they also talked among each other, and so they would say, no, don't go to East Texas because there's a lot of prejudice against Hispanics, or go over here to the Mesilla Valley. And that's how Dad got to come to the Mesilla Valley, but he was alone. He left my mother and my oldest brother back in Tlahualilo, Torreon area. So because he was a tractor driver, they worked him during the farming season where they had to work 24/7 to get the land ready for planting. So they liked his work, and the rancher, which was Snow Ranch at that time, said, we want to keep you, we want to bring your family. So they got the ranch lawyer to fix the papers, and that's how my mother and my brother were able to come and join my father. But she said it was a whole different culture. It was just a whole different place. We didn't have to pay rent or electricity, but the pay was lower for the workers because we were living there.
My dad was a farm worker for many years, but he also developed a trade as a mechanic and also as a developer. There was a station wagon abandoned, and he took the top off the station wagon and put it on the truck. And to my knowledge, it almost seems like that was the camper, you know. Because when we went to El Paso, there was 3 or 4 cars following my dad on the truck. I said, where did you get that? He said, I built it.
My dad, although he only went to school through the 6th grade, always highly encouraged education. So he himself, and I remember at the time thinking, I'm so proud of him because he decided to go to ESL classes. And he learned English. And he learned enough English that he was able to become the head plumber at Stahmann. He went to Mr. Stahmann, actually flew him in his airplane so he could take his test. And he didn't pass it the first time, but he wasn't discouraged. They went back again. He passed his certification for plumbing. So then he became head plumber at Stahmann Farms.
They were blacksmiths, so which is an art, you know, and my father started working all kinds of types of blacksmithing, blacksmith shop and welding and making tools. He was a tool maker. He was all kinds of creative, artistic, ornamental fencing and all that. So he knew all those arts. In fact, my mother used to gripe at him because everything that got broken, he would repair it with iron or some kind of metal and everything. And my mother once told him, "Ay, Alfredo, one of these days when my bones or something break, you're gonna replace me with a metal, some kind of metal and everything welded to me and everything." So that's the way my father was. He was a welder, but he was welding mechanical parts all the time, fixing them up and everything. Especially in Stahmann Farms, when they needed to repair the equipment for the picking up the pecans and all that. He was there to repair all that. In fact, some of the tools and machines that were used in the farm were made by my father and his co-workers. They were invented there. He loved his work, and we were there for about 20 years probably.
And my dad started irrigating cotton fields. They had a lot of cotton. They had geese that they would release the geese and they would go and clean the cotton. I remember seeing that.
He would sell the geese and would sell the goose feathers for the pillows and then the meat to sell it.
So in the 1950s, my grandfather decided to buy 500,000 geese so that they could weed the cotton. They didn't have to have the men with hoes weeding the cotton. And so it worked for a while, but then the webbed feet of the geese started compacting the soil and it didn't allow the water to percolate through. We had to stop being in the goose business. And so then from there he got into the chicken business. He wanted to fertilize naturally. And so he got into the chicken business so we would have a lot of manure to be able to fertilize the pecan trees. We used to have a commissary here, a store, that was a mercantile store actually, and it used to sell everything. We had a butcher shop, we had a fruit section, they sold tires, material like fabric to make dresses, clothes, things like that. They had a gasoline station together with the store, and so all of the employees could come and charge their groceries to their account and charge that they could get gas too and charge the gas, and everything was sold to them at cost. I didn't know that until just recently. My first job was to work at the store. I was 9 years old, and so I kept bugging my father that I wanted to work and I want to work. So he took me to the store and just dropped me off one morning like at 7:30. Just dropped me off. The first thing I did was go in and push on the cash register. I pushed $1 million in there and rang it up. And the manager was very nervous about that, but it all turned out okay.
You wanted to learn something that would start you in the fields, and you get up to where, for example, me, I started in the fields. I ended up working with the electricians, which was awesome because I learned a lot. I learned carpentry, I learned electricity. I worked in the store, I worked pumping gas. It was awesome. It's a beautiful place to work, and every time I pass by there, it's good memories come by, man.
What I remember most was that there was always work on the farm, either harvesting pecans, picking cotton, hoeing the cotton fields, all types of work. I did all that, and then for my final job on the farm, I worked a couple of years at the country store that they had, and that was considered more like a blue-collar job, a step up from working in the fields. In those days, a gallon of regular gasoline was 27 cents and 32 cents for the premium gasoline, which they called ethyl at the time.
Another fun fact is I actually worked at the Stahmann store. Randy Stahmann is the youngest of the kids, and Randy was considered wild, and he would do his own thing, whereas the other three, I think, were maybe raised a little more responsibly, I don't know. But Randy was the baby, so Randy would go with all his friends, and he would tell him, yeah, you can get that, yeah, you can get whatever you want. And then what I would do is I would jot it all down. I would charge it to his dad, How brazen of me, huh? Anyway, I did. And then the manager would say, he said, well, if you think, let's go ahead and turn it in. And I would tell him, well, won't it be a loss to you when you do, end of the year accounting? And then he would say, you're right. So Randy, little did he know that we did jot down everything. Yeah, but Randy's passed away, so yeah, he wouldn't be mad at me.
I know he would report like at times the report he made every year at the payroll time. People would stand there and he would report, this year we made a $3 million profit. Yeah, it sounds like a little bit, for the comparison to that nowadays. But in those days, $3 million was a lot of money. And we would judge the fact that, well, how much is that coming back to us? Yeah, it came back to us in the pension and the retirement and all that he had for us. So he was very much a humane person.
That man really appreciated his people. He loved those people because those people made him.
Everybody got a little bit of a bonus, but it was because, like Mr. Stahmann said, if you will take care that nobody steals from us, because this is for all of us. So if people are taking from me, we won't have enough for me to share. And so it worked. It worked.
And that man created a good thing. They had profit sharing. Up to right now, my mom is still living off of that profit sharing with my dad invested in stocks, and she's still surviving on that.
My dad, he just wanted to work and wanted to live so badly. He would make himself go to work, and finally one of the supervisors there at the office complex talked to my dad and said, you're not doing well. Why don't you just concentrate on taking care of yourself? Well, Mr. Stahmann, Bill Jr., found out about it, and what he did is he ended up, because they had cut my dad's salary in half. Well, Mr. Stahmann, when he heard this, he retroactive paid him all of the money that, who else would have done that?
And Mr. Stahmann was always very open to the public. He was very he had a lot of people skills and a lot of humanity. And of course passed it on to his sons and his grandkids.
He was fluent in Spanish, which is another thing that showed his consideration for the people that worked for him. He learned their language and their customs and traditions and supported them.
I can remember as young as 4 years old, going up to the airport. Stahmann had a private airport. We called it La Mesa. It was a big mesa, and he would open it up to the workers.
We had community events like the Matachines and the festivity days for the Independence Day of Mexico and the Cinco de Mayo celebration and Dia de los Muertos, and all those were community related.
For Christmas, he would have a truck. They'd go to every single house in Stahmann's, and they would knock on the door and ask how many kids there was in the house. And every kid would get a bag of candy and an orange and an apple and that, but every year. And he would do that for all the kids.
And it was just a lot of things that we had at the farm that Stahmann Farms would provide, medical needs for the people working there. We didn't have to go to Las Cruces or El Paso for our medical needs. He had a physician close to the area that we could go, and also even a priest was also brought in so we could attend church.
My mom says that she will say that she lived the happiest days of her life ever, that she wishes she could go back. And it makes me sad because she can't.
We had the monkeys, we used to call them, the lightweight fellas that would get up on the trees all the way up to the top, connect a rope to a tractor, and they would shake every leaf, every branch and everything, and all the big guns would come down. Nowadays, they have the one big machine that hooks up the stem of the tree and shakes it all. That's it, don't worry about it.
And then we would clear out all the trees and the twigs and everything, and we pick the pecans, and then they would pay us by, the weight. But then they came up with like a vacuum cleaner that picked the twigs and the leaves and the pecans all at the same time. And so slowly through time, they didn't need as many workers as before.
One of our core values is continual improvement, and so we're always looking out to see how we can improve our processes, our farming, our shelling, our sorting processes all the time. The current acreage of this farm is 3,300 acres. We used to be the largest pecan grower in the world, but there's some bigger plantings now. I think that we probably are the largest in New Mexico. Pecans are super healthy. They have the highest amount of antioxidants than any other nut, and they're delicious. You can put them in anything. You can put them on salads, you can make pecan butter out of them, you can put them in breads, you can crust chicken with it. They're just super versatile.
It all depends on the year. This year was a good year, and we ran about 12 million pounds through the plant. But even then, I think we could probably double that. The future plans are to continue making our farming practices more sustainable, and to focus on having healthy soils and conserving our water. We're putting in a 100-acre sprinkler project this year with help from NRCS. We're expanding our farm in Lordsburg, planting 1,400 acres of pecans and pistachios. And a variety of crops is also a big change that's coming. Of course, everyone is concerned with what the future holds and what the climate may look like in 5, 10, 15, 20 years, how much water there's going to be. You know, with a little bit of time and with help from local, state, and federal governments, farming's going to do fine here. We ship pecans to Asia, to Canada, to Europe, Middle East, all over the place.
This is what we do. It's in our blood. It's ingrained, and so it's a beautiful life. So that's why the quality of life is great here.
Many times when I drive through Stahmann Farms, I see cars parked alongside the road and people taking pictures amongst the tunnel of trees. I often wonder how many of them know the history, the stories, the legacy of many humble people who lived and worked here. Hello, everybody. My name is Blanca Araujo. I am a professor in the College of Health, Education, and Social Transformation here at New Mexico State University. I am also one of the very lucky people who had the privilege of growing up in Stahmann Farms. My father, Jorge, rest in peace, worked in Stahmann for 44 years. He was a mayordomo in the sorteadora, the pecan sorter. And my family lived in Esperanza first. We started there, and then we moved to Plaza. There were two of the ranchos that were scattered around the farm and served as a housing for the workers and their families. I lived in Stahmann all my childhood. And Stahmann was a wonderful place to live, as you saw through the documentary. All of the kids would spend much time outside under the trees, riding our bikes, playing kickball, baseball, soccer, and even building tree houses. Stahmann was a place where people got married. A lot of people got married in Stahmann, had babies, some were born there, people died there, and for many of us, Stahmann helped shape who we are today. And although it sounds cliche-ish, everyone knew everybody, and everybody would take care of each other. This was evident one day when me and my sister got in trouble because we crossed the street. I don't know why we crossed the street. My father always prohibited us from crossing the street, and then one day we just decided to be sneaky and cross the street. So when my dad got home that night, the first time we heard was, "Why were you crossing the streets, mijas?" Somebody had told on us. But it was a good thing because they were taking care of us. Some of my fondest memories are of the Stahmann yearly barbacoa. And this was a big company fiesta, and it was for the workers, and it was after the pecan harvest was over. The barbacoa took place in the Stahmann airport, up on the mesa, and lots of planning took place. And from listening to the Oral History Project, I learned that my father was instrumental in fabricating a huge barbecue grill and pit that was below ground, in which they would cook almost 2,000 pounds of beef for the big party. They would drop the beef with a winch in the hole. They would cover it and leave it there all night and then bring it out the next day. The beef was soft and tender, and there was tons of beef for everybody that attended. The women would help cook, like Mrs. Ceniceros, who we collected stories from. She told us that she cooked the rice. Other ladies cooked the beans, bread, salsa, tortillas. Cruz Mesa would bring mariachis, and there was even karaoke in which Mr. Stahmann would participate at times. There was a lot of beer for the adults, a lot of beer, and ice cream for the kids. There was always a line of cars to get to the barbacoas. The barbacoas are one of my best memories of Stahmann. I remember everybody together and everybody celebrating the end of the harvest. There are many similar stories that I heard in the Oral History Project that I will share a little bit about now. And this started in 2016. A group of professors, Dr. Rodolfo Chavez, Judith Flores Carmona, and myself began a project of collecting the oral histories of the people who lived and worked in Stahmann Farms. We collected the stories from 13 people and families, and unfortunately, around half of these people, or maybe even a little bit more, have already passed away. Employees who lived in the company ranchos had many stories to share. They talked about what it was like to live in the farm, about the treatment they received from the owners, stories of what it was like working in Stahmann, about raising children in the farm, and about the long impact this life and upbringing has had on at least 3 or 4 generations of Southern New Mexicans. It truly was a privilege to listen to the stories. And while I would like to share a lot of stories, I will only share a few with you today. The first one I'm going to share is, I call it La Llorona. And it's about me and my friend Lupe. My friend Lupita, we were riding our bikes one day like we always did. We were always out riding our bikes through the trees and the dirt roads. And we were just hanging out talking, and we happened to look over through the trees. And we saw a lady in a long flowing gown walking through the trees. And we both looked at each other and we screamed. We dropped our bikes. I still don't know why we dropped the bikes. I think it would have been quicker to ride the bikes. We dropped them and we ran. We ran to our house. And ever since then, I firmly believed that I had seen La Llorona, which I had heard many stories about as a kid. So fast forward 40 years later, when I'm collecting the stories, I'm sitting around the kitchen table listening to the Ortiz family, and they were telling me stories about people that lived in Stahmann. And they shared that they knew of this lady who used to like to drink. And she would get drunk, and she would like to walk amongst the trees in her long flowing gown. So when I heard this story, I was like, oh my goodness, that's my Llorona right there. It was not La Llorona, it was a lady from Stahmann who liked to drink. So this, needless to say, I need to tell my friend Lupita, I need to find her and tell her, because she probably still thinks that La Llorona exists. I like to tell this story because it reminds me of how awesome it was to be a kid in Stahmann. I heard many stories of the people I interviewed about bike riding through the pecan trees. Miss Pavia shared that she would meet her friends halfway between the trees, between ranchos. They also shared stories about many parties in Stahmann. Many people had weddings, quinceañeras, baby showers, all under the trees. They talked about the matachines who would dance from rancho to rancho for Our Lady of Guadalupe Day. And then I also remember that they had a Catholic Mass in the old planta in Plaza, and they also had catechism in Plaza. So they took a priest from San Miguel, and he would have the Mass and the catechism. My next story I call Hey, and this one comes from Mr. Solis. And he explained to me how Mr. Stahmann had helped a lot of people buy their own homes. And you can still find a lot of these homes in the communities of El Alto de las Flores, which is close to San Miguel, and in Del Cerro, which you can see as you're riding to El Paso on Alpha Highway I-10. And so Mr. Solis recounted that he wanted to build his own home, but he wanted to build it from the ground up, and the bank would not loan him the money unless his house was already built. So he thought of going to Stahmann, which was now being run by one of the Stahmann daughters, and he wanted to ask her for help. So he went and asked Miss Stahmann for $57,000 so he could build his house. She looked at him, she thought about it, and she said, wow, we've never lent so much money before. So Mr. Solis knew that she liked Julio Iglesias a lot. So he offered her, he made an offer. He said, I'll pay you $1,000 extra in interest, and I'll sing you a Julio Iglesias song. So she just looked at him and said, let me think about that. So he left. He didn't hear from her. 5 days later, he calls her. She calls him, excuse me, and she asked him to go to the office. So he walks into the office, and she tells him, start singing. So he smiled. Does that mean you're gonna lend me the money? Start singing and we can talk later. So he sang the song Hey by Julio Iglesias. He got the money, he sang the song, and he built his home. And then he was able to repay the loan with the $1,000 extra in due time. And then I asked him, so did you sign a contract? And he said, oh no, back then all we did was a handshake and a Julio Iglesias song. And that's the way it was. That's the way it was back then in Stahmann. There were no contracts, you were trusted by your word. Several participants shared that when they needed a car, they would tell Mr. Stahmann, and he would tell them, get in the car, let's go to Cruces and choose which car you wanted. So they would always do that. And Mr. Stahmann would buy the car in cash, and the worker would take his car home, and they would take the money out of his paycheck. But the worker wouldn't have to pay interest. So it worked for both, right? So when I shared this with my mom, she told me that we too had benefited from that, and that my dad had bought a Ford Mercury using this honor system. And I never knew this story until I started listening to the stories from the people. I also heard stories about working with the thousands of geese that once existed in Stahmann and that served to eat the weeds. Mr. Armendariz shared how he had to place the geese eggs in the incubator, and they would check to see if the eggs had a baby inside, a baby gosling. And they would use a light to check the egg, so they would use the light, and if the egg had a little spot on it, that meant that the egg had a baby gosling. If the egg looked clear, then there was no baby. So the eggs that had the baby were moved to a smaller incubator until the goslings were born. Sometimes the goslings could not emerge from their shell, so Mr. Armendariz had to crack the egg and help the babies come out. And he shared that he would go home and tell his mom that he never wanted to eat eggs for breakfast ever again. The Bevel sisters shared how they lived next to the Stahmanns, so they benefited from hand-me-down clothes from the Stahmann daughters. And Doris shared that they once got a petticoat that had been bought in New York from the daughters, and they said that all the sisters loved it. They all wore it even as a skirt, and they wore it until it was pieces. Miss Chabelita Uribe, who was 104 years old when we interviewed her, told us about her husband who would deliver fresh milk to all the ranchos every day, every home. He was a Stahmann milkman. And then we have Mr. Gonzalez, who bought around 30 acres of land and planted his own pecan trees. And he had a university professor who would send him agriculture students to learn from him and his land. And he was so knowledgeable about the land that the university professor would constantly ask Mr. Gonzalez, which university did you attend? And Mr. Gonzalez would reply by saying that he attended La Universidad del Hambre, the University of Hunger. And the professor was astounded to know that he had not attended college. All this came from his experience working in Stahmann. So this was a common theme in our research project. The workers learned so many skills in Stahmann, and as you heard in the documentary, there was electricians, carpenters, designers, mechanics, welders, bookkeepers, and so many other occupations that they learned on the job. Ms. Villaseñor remembered how her entire family would pick the leftover pecans in what we call la pepena. And her children would get out of school and the whole family would pick as much as they could. They were paid by weight, so the more buckets they could get, the more money for the family. And she described it as a procession. She said, oh, you saw all these families in a procession with all their kids going to pick la pepena. And she laughed, she called it a peregrinación. All of the participants shared that they were very proud to live and work in Stahmann, and that it had helped their children immensely. Doris Bevel said it best. We bragged about how we lived in the 4,700 acres of pecan orchards, the largest orchard in the world. It was a very big sense of pride to say that we lived in Stahmann Farms. When I think about the legacy of Stahmann Farms, I think of the generation of people that were impacted from the hard work, the joy, and the sense of community fostered by the people who worked and lived here. Listening to the stories, many of the descendants of the workers of Stahmann have gone on to become successful in many facets of life, personally, academically, professionally. And I can still feel the pride when people share that they grew up or worked in Stahmann. I myself am very proud to be from Stahmann. In conclusion, my hope is that next time when you take a drive on Highway 28 and drive through Stahmann Farms, you look beyond the beauty of the trees and you think of the hardworking people who worked and are still working there, and of the families who flourished in this beautiful place. When you drive through there again, remember their fascinating stories and their lasting legacy. Thank you.
And joining us now for a panel discussion is Blanca Araujo. Also joining us is Marta Moran-Edwards and Julio Aleman. Now, they were all raised at Stahmann Farms, and they continue to take part in reunions with others from this agricultural community. And thanks for all of you coming in today. It's a wonderful subject, and I've really enjoyed hearing what we've heard so far. And we do have some questions from the audience now. Sir, if you would identify yourself and say who you want to answer your question.
Thank you. My name is Inigo Garcia Bryce. I'm a professor of history here at NMSU. And my question is for Blanca. I wanted to congratulate you first for this wonderful project and for all the stories that you've shared with us. My question is whether these stories are going to be archived here at the Rio Grande Archives, or whether they'll be made available on the web so that we can listen to the full stories and the full transcripts of all of these people that you've been able to interview.
Yes, thank you. Yes, we plan on archiving them here at the NMSU Library or at the Farm and Ranch Museum archives, so one of the two. And we're in the process of starting to get everything prepared to do so.
Thank you. So my question is for the professor, and my question is, so you had mentioned that half of the people that you'd interviewed during this have since passed away. In regards to that, how has this project, how have you grown as a documentarian, and what would you have changed to your process if you were starting from the beginning? That's it, I guess.
Oh, thank you for the question. Personally, I grew a lot, and more than as a documentarian, as a human being, I learned a lot about my family. The history of my own family, I learned a lot about my dad listening to the stories, but also the history of Stahmann Farms, that even though I grew up there all my life, I never knew a lot of the stuff that I heard from the beautiful stories that I heard. And as a documentarian, I think it's important to carry on with the process of the project. I feel like I dropped the ball a little bit in continuing the process, but I was very grateful that I was able to get the stories from the people that we did, so that before they passed away. But I also think that I learned that it's important to keep collecting, continuing to get more stories from people who worked and lived there. And I was talking to Marta, and she was telling me, yes, the stories are so important. We need people to hear these stories, especially our kids, our generations. And I think that that's important. As a documentarian, I feel like I need to continue the project.
I want to add a little bit to that. Right now, while we're still present, living, there's a chance for our stories to be recorded and videotaped, because we do have a lot of people that still have a lot of things to tell about the legacy and history of Stahmann Farms. So there would be a chance right now to work on a project where we can record and videotape all those people that are present here now, to tell all those experiences.
And to add to that, we're just ordinary people that grew up in an extraordinary place, and the story needs to be told, because when you drive to Stahmann Farms, there's nothing there that shows you that all these families live there. So that was the importance of saying this story. It's a unique place, and a lot of people grew up there, and the story needs to be told, or else it's lost.
And if there are any other questions for the audience, come on up, and in the meantime, I'll ask Marta a question as well.
Yes,
sir. Marta, what can we today learn from the way you grew up and the way Stahmann Farms influenced you?
That's a good question. I think the voices of ordinary people need to be heard. I know that in future generations, the story of Stahmann Farms and Mr. Stahmann and his family is not going to be lost. But the stories of the families that grew up there have every chance to be lost. So I think that just voicing what a unique place this was in this area in the Mesilla Valley, and how many people were influenced by it. I think that's the importance of it. We're still around, our children, the next generation. I think it needs to be heard.
And Julio, how is the way you grew up there different from the way kids grow up today?
Oh, everything just was a natural situation. We didn't have to worry about how we're going to play, with our electronic equipment, or lock ourselves up in the telephone. We just went out there and took up whatever was there to use the environment itself to play with and be creative. Creativity was our biggest challenge, our biggest helper. So that was the biggest thing. One of the things that we had a carpenter shop in Lomas, and a lot of people that lived in that ranch picked up the wood, and we created all kinds of toys from that wood. Mm-hmm. Kites and cars and boats or whatever. And just because the wood that was there and what the nails, and so things like that were what we played with and created our own world.
A sense of community we don't often see
No,
today.
not anymore. Values that have been lost already.
Let's see. Charlene asked, will they ever consider reopening the store? Can anybody answer that?
I wish they would.
No. Sally Stahmann said that the store is being run as a business. In fact, it's an agricultural business. They're raising mushrooms inside the store now.
Oh, okay.
And the profit, her daughter-in-law is a person who's doing that.
They're growing mushrooms there.
Mushrooms, yes, yes.
And what's the status of the farm today? Is it still 47,000 acres? How big is it? Or was it?
It's not as big as it used to be. I think she has already implemented a different strategy. Mm-hmm. They used to say it was 6,000 before, but I guess a lot of the land has been probably rented or for somebody else. But they're seeking other sources and entrepreneurial sources, agricultural sources around the southern New Mexico area.
Do the little ranches still exist within?
No, there's only one by the side of the road that is still there. It has like 4 or 5 houses, but the rest of the ranchos were demolished in the 80s, around 84, yes. 85, around there.
The properties where the buildings were are still marked there with the dirt, but they haven't moved out the dirt to plant any more plants or trees or whatever.
Kind of the skeleton is still there.
Yeah. It kind of sad when we go through there and we see it empty and buried, and I said, oh my God, it's memories all that start coming out.
Do we have a question from the audience here? Come on up to the microphone.
Thank you so much for sharing your stories. I've thoroughly enjoyed listening to them. My question is this. I understand that Mr. Stahmann had a contract with the federal government during the war years from 1942 through 1946 to use POWs, specifically German and Italian POWs, for labor because of the shortage of Americans being overseas fighting, and also the fact that the Bracero program was not active in those years. And I was wondering if you have any memories or have heard stories about working with the prisoner of war men, and what kinds of relationships might have developed between those living on Stahmann's and the POWs.
I recall from one of the interviews from the project that one, I believe it was Mrs. Bevel who mentioned that they did have the prisoners of war on the Snow Ranch, somewhere in the Snow Ranch. And I know that there's archives of that history at the New Mexico Farm and Ranch Museum, but that's all I know. I don't recall any relationships or I don't know about.
Can y'all tell us what are the reunions like? How many people come to the reunions now, and what do y'all do?
First of all, we have to give credit. I have to give credit to one person that started the reunions about 15 years ago. His name is Mr. Raul Jara, who is also grew up with us in Stahmann Farms, and he was in the video, in the documentary. And he started these meetings about 15 years ago, little by little, and every 3 months, one meeting here in Las Cruces and one in the El Paso area, because a lot of people moved to the El Paso area. And then eventually they became a lot more popular. So there were times when we had 15 people, and there were times when we had even close to 60 or 80 people. We had them at the building where the store used to be, but then they filled it up because they needed it, so we couldn't have them there anymore. But we still carry them on, and we have to have that tradition, doing it in one in Las Cruces, one in El Paso.
Do you
every
still
3
do
months.
the barbacoa?
Yes, we have sometimes. We have them sometimes in a public, in one of the private restaurants or building, and we have them sometimes in the homes of the Stahmann Farms people that invite us to their house and everything. Okay. And we share just about everything. There's always something to share. Yes.
And we have another question. Go ahead.
Hi. How do you feel like your time growing up in Stahmann Farms, which sounded like kind of a countercultural microcosm, a lot of ways that the schema was very different from the outside world. How do you feel like that experience impacted your cultural identity, whether you identify as Hispanic or Mexican American? And then also, how do you feel like that was impacted upon leaving Stahmann Farms into the outer world?
I need to mention a couple of things. Number one, we identified with the Mexican culture because most of our parents had come from Mexico. But within the farm itself, there were people from other places also. We had a family from Argentina, one from Spain, another from I think from other countries that were in Europe. So we had a variety. But also we shared our values and culture with other communities south of Stahmann Farms, especially with the Gadsden School District area. And most of the people that went to Gadsden School District was a Mexican American high school district, because most of the communities were Mexican American. We had a different attitude when we came to Las Cruces, because most of the people in Las Cruces were divided into, Mexicans and Mexican Americans, and then the white Anglo community in those days. So it was a shock to us, because in Mesilla, where I went to school, most of us were Mexican, and all of a sudden we went to junior high, and we had to share times with the white people, the white Anglo culture, and it was a totally different situation, and then it was different in the high school even, and of course in those days most of the activities and that were provided for us were more white American activities, and we challenged that, in a good sense, by being active in the activities of the schools and with the community. But so that was a difference. Nowadays it's totally open, and it's more sharing and everything, and a lot better. Gadsden, it was different. Over there, it was more Mexican. In fact, there was one day when they invited a band from Las Cruces that played Led Zeppelin and hard rock and all that. They invited them to one of the Gadsden dances, and they were booed out and everything, because they didn't play the kind of music that the Gadsden dancers there at the dance wanted,
Did you have a girlfriend in both places too?
Yes. Yes. I could have gone to Hatch or El Paso a little bit more, but I decided to be conservative. Yes. Thank you.
Just to answer that question, my experience was I was the first group of students that didn't go to Gadsden. They had redone the district, and people from Stahmann Farms originally went to Gadsden, and that year they needed to go to the Las Cruces Public School District at Zia Junior High. And so that was the first cultural shock that happened. And of course, a lot of fights broke out, and there was a lot of getting to know each other, a lot of checking out, your way of thinking to my way of thinking, and it took maybe 2 years through junior high. By the time we all got to high school, people were dating each other, people were interacting, things were happening, but it didn't happen quickly. It was those 2 years, and those poor teachers at Zia Junior High had to deal with that shock of two cultures coming together.
And we have time for one more question, and sir, you get the honor.
Okay, when we were teenagers, going to school, going to high school, everybody knew that you were from Stahmann Farms, because the juice from those things would get on your hands and they would never come off. Everybody was in their pocket from Stahmann Farms, and their hands in their pocket. What I'm gonna ask Mr. Aleman, I would have known. Did they ever found a way to take that black stuff off your hands?
No.
The soap hasn't been invented yet. Huh?
No. We were limited in a lot of ways, because, for example, I think the only cologne that was out there at that time was only one it was a Old Spice, yes, yeah. Old Spice. So when we had picked the onions, and we were smelled like onions all in our clothing and everything. That was the only cologne that we could use that was any good. And then we didn't have all the cleaning products that have nowadays, or anybody didn't do a chemical study about how to get that juice out of there, the sap from the pecans. So it was very hard to get it off. I
remember that the girls wouldn't go out with us because they knew they were from Stahmann, and we're gonna get the stuff on our hands.
Yeah, the girls at Las Cruces shied away from it because they couldn't hold their hand and everything.
And when it was smelled like a mixture of Old Spice and onion, means you were going on a date,
yes,
right?
Exactly. Yes, all right, definitely.
Okay, thank you, sir. And we thank you all for joining us for Borderland Storytellers. Special thanks to our speakers, Blanca Araujo, Marta Edwards, and Julio Aleman, as well as our partners who have worked to collaborate with us on this project. Thank you for joining us. I'm Nick Miller.